is a great capstone, and that Jason, we've talked a lot about natural resource management and the physical and ecological sciences today, and Jason just really articulated some of the challenges of making data-driven decisions from a natural resources monitoring standpoint. And we've got Retta Bruegger, who's an extension specialist at Colorado State University, that's going to talk to us a little about the social science side of that, I believe, and how we can think all we want about ecological science and how we refine our tools. But if we don't think about the social sciences, we might be missing the boat. So.
Yeah, excellent introduction. Well, maybe I'll just sit down actually. Just kidding. But so, yeah, I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about humans now. And in your programs, it might say Maria Fernandez-Jimenez is giving this talk, but it's actually me. She is double booked because she's on the board. So I adapted some of the key principles in her talk, and then I'll be speaking about them, each of them, based on research and then also some of my own experience. And as you mentioned, I'm in extension, and so my job is kind of connecting information with trying to encourage people to make data-driven decisions and to actually use that information in decisions that they make. So adaptive management is something we talk a lot about in rangeland management, right? And at the core of adaptive management, we have this cycle, right? Plan, do, monitor, and evaluate, and then adapt. And this is predicated, I think, on kind of the core belief that if people have better information, if technical challenges are overcome and we have better data, we have better analyses, we will apply that information to decisions, right? And that will inform our planning processes and the whole loop going around. In science communication, this is called the deficit model, and it's based on, as the name suggests, the idea of a deficit, that if people are not making good decisions, it's because they lack information. And what will solve that problem is more information. So I think this has informed a lot of outreach in the past, and I think it's also something that's at the core of what we believe in extension. If we put better information into the hands of people, they will use that information. However, sometimes reality doesn't quite play out so smoothly, right? It's not a direct line from monitoring and evaluating or learning into adaptation. And this model of how we function has actually been challenged in the science communication literature and also in things like behavioral economics and social psychology. So there's quite a few challenges to this conception of how we work. Now, my interest, and maybe something that you're all interested in too as people who work with data and work with land management, is, okay, so let's say it doesn't quite play out like this in reality. Better information does not directly lead to decisions. If that's not the case, then what can I learn to make me a little more effective at my job, to maybe make myself a little more reflective as a human being, and to actually accomplish the work I want to accomplish, which is hypothetically getting data into the hands, getting information that's meaningful to people into their hands and seeing them actually apply that information in their actions. So quickly, I'm going to go over a couple of the challenges to the deficit model, and I'm going to go over them because I think they're fun. And actually, that's why I agreed to do this talk, because I thought it would be fun to talk about it. I'll reflect on that afterwards. But I think that the challenge is there's so much information out now about how we function as human beings, and I just find it really fascinating and illuminating. So I'm not going to cite specific studies, but I am going to give you a really good summary talk that you can go to and check it out. And it's actually a professor of science communication who can do a much better job than I can. But basically, we know from quite a lot of research, and I think consilience from different fields, that we're far more likely to assimilate information if it agrees with what we already believe. So we're not just neutral foragers for information. Like cattle on the rangeland, we might go towards specific plants and not towards others. And we're like that as far as the research suggests with information. We're not just interpreting it neutrally. We're filtering it through values, beliefs, past experience. Past experience is also really powerful. Our personal experiences are really powerful for how we look at data. And values, as well as past experience, can help us really navigate complex information, right? instead of being faced with complexity, we can reduce it down to a simple value in some cases. And that's really constructive because we're faced with a lot of challenges and a lot of decisions every single day. We don't actually want our brains to implode. But I think that the tendency to lump into or filter new information through past experience and through values can at times really hinder us from being adaptive. So, and that probably applies to rangelands, right? So take a photo with your camera on your phone. But this talk, if you Google it, is a really excellent summary pertaining to science communication if you're interested. And I could also share it after the talk. So what about us on rangeland? I'll wait until when we're dealing with rangeland issues and land management, we are never working in a value-neutral context, right? And we're never working in a context in which people don't bring a lot of personal experience to the table. I have a picture here of wild horses. So that's one example of different ways that people look at the rangeland. And depending on how you feel about wild horses, that may change how you interpret information that's brought to you. I think in the rangeland field, we also have a lot of other issues that may influence how you interpret data. I, myself, and people I work with probably vary in how we feel about these things. So when presented with the same information, I think it's unlikely that we're going to walk away with the same takeaway because we do have values at play in our field. We all probably, well, maybe not all of us, but some of us came into rangelands because we cared about something and we wanted to work on it. So we're bringing that to how we think about and filter information. All right, so deficit model, going back to this idea. Reality maybe doesn't play out quite so smoothly between new information and change of behavior. But as far as this goes, from what I understand from the science communication researchers, it's not good, it's not bad, it just is. So it's not about necessarily changing the fact that we use heuristics to filter information, but I think it's more about understanding how to work within this reality as people who want to get information into the hands of people and have them potentially be more adaptive in their decisions. So how do we remove the barrier between learning and adaptation, right? One proposed way to do so is collaborative adaptive management, or some call it participatory research. And there's other ways that people describe this, but basically it's a way of creating meaning together, working with people to maybe interpret analyses and understand what it means as a group. I've participated in a couple of different collaborative research projects, and they're interesting. And I do think they provide a really great way of coming together about information and then forming a shared understanding of what it means. But they're not a panacea, and there are issues occasionally with how collaboration can be implemented. So I'm going to spend the remainder of my talk kind of giving some examples of how we've implemented collaborative adaptive management in projects that I've worked on, kind of what I learned from it, and then conclude with some simple recommendations. So my first one, I mentioned create meaning together. I'm going to give you an example of a project that we worked on in northwestern Colorado. So this was a project where we engaged stakeholders at the very beginning. It was about 15 people, and people who were specifically, they were ranchers, local agency folks, the local weed manager, extension, et cetera. And these were people who came to us with a question. They wanted to know how to rehabilitate areas of their rangelands which they had treated with herbicide, specifically herbicide targeting the white top. They wanted to know what seeding treatments might be effective at rehabilitating those areas where herbicide had been applied. So the question came from them. We discussed as a group how we were going to answer this question. We vetted different options. We decided on the methods together, and then we implemented the experiment. It was supposed to be 2 years, but turned out to be 3. And we decided on 2 treatments that we would apply. So it really was done collaboratively. So looking at this graph, along the y-axis is percent cover, and along the x-axis is grouped by year the 3 different treatments. We have control, We have broadcast seeding that's labeled seed, and then we had seed plus harrowing applied. And when you look at this graph, since you all look at graphs, I want you to think about, what do you assume when you look at this? What do you predict? What do you wonder about? What are you surprised by? So anyone willing to share something that they predict or wonder when they look at this information?
I wonder what was happening in 2015 that caused control and treatment to change, and I think about climate.
Cool. Anyone else? All right. I'll take that as a no. All right, yeah. So 2015, it rained a lot. That's what happened. It was amazing and really fun. But I think looking at this, and the bottom of the slide kind of tells you what we found. But you can see the arrow bars are not different. None of these treatments were significantly different. So we didn't find that seeding resulted in more cover of perennial native grasses. So I kind of did a little mini demonstration there. This is what I did with the group of stakeholders at the 2-year mark of our experiment. We came together at a meeting. It was actually in a coffee shop, and we used this series of tiered questions. So people answered this first tier, quiet writing time, and then we would have a group discussion. And then I'm not showing all the tiers of questioning here, but then we would move to this. I believe the data suggests because. And this question, additional data that would help me verify, confirm my explanation is this. I want to point out that this, I think, starting with the tier 1 questions is really different from jumping to, I believe the data suggests because. I think it's a really different way of creating meaning. So I found this to be a really interesting exercise, and I've done it a couple times with different groups. And you know, what happened? What did people actually take away? That was my question. I wanted to know what people learned from this. So these are some of the responses that people wrote and shared also in our focus group. First one, 50% of the group thought spraying alone may be enough to improve both cover and density of native grass. This would be the most economical way to rehabilitate white top infested range. About 50% had that conclusion. So it wasn't 100%. And then other comments, 75% thought that there was too little data. We need to continue monitoring. They didn't feel like the results were real, and they didn't feel like the results reflected what was true to them, right? Other people said not enough data and small sample size. I think the last two are interesting because I was the only scientist and I wasn't filling out this information, or the only official researcher. So stakeholders saying what researchers say to each other all the time. But I think this was informative for me, because I want to know what people are taking away from research projects that we do. And I think you can see here, even though we designed this project from start to finish together as a group, we did not all end up in the same place. We ended up in different places. Despite that, there's some other projects I've worked on that I'm not going to go into detail on because of time limitations. But a question you might have is, does this actually work in terms of making that connection stronger between learning and changing behavior? Verdict's still out on that, but I do want to share some of our survey results. This is just one result we got when I surveyed stakeholders on a different project about midway through the project. And I think it's reflective of some other comments we got. So people wrote, I'm likely, or an example of what people wrote, I'm likely to implement management changes because the data seems real. But I do think that there is a relationship between participation and application. Second thing, so I talked a little bit about, how can you create meaning together and what are some tools to do so. I want to skip now to cooperative monitoring. That's as a way of creating meaning together and as a way of hopefully making that connection stronger between learning and adapting. So cooperative monitoring has a lot of different manifestations. In extension, I haven't had that much success trying to encourage ranchers to monitor, but there are studies out there that show people are much more likely to implement management actions when they've done the monitoring themselves. This is from Danielson et al. 2007. And there is a cooperative monitoring agreement with BLM. as far as I understand, a memorandum of understanding. So that might be something that is very useful to people who work in BLM as a tool if you'd like to cultivate more buy-in for the data and how the data informs management decisions. I think that cooperative monitoring also, is pretty logical, I guess, to see how it could build trust and it could build buy-in, kill multiple birds with one stone, as long as those birds aren't sage-grouse. That's good. All right, the third thing I want to talk about in terms of making this connection between information and action is something that is probably so simple that I almost don't want to include it, but I'm going to include it because the literature suggests it is in fact really important, and that is investing in relationships. I was talking to my brother-in-law who is a social worker, and he deals with situations with patients essentially who are dealing with things like addiction and post-traumatic stress syndrome and other types of acute problems and struggles. And he and I do really different work, but I always find it really interesting to talk to him because in some ways I think there are similarities between what he does and what I'm trying to do. I would love to, in extension, encourage people and motivate people to make better decisions using data and to adapt in response to information. And I think in some ways that's what he's hoping to do as a social worker, right? He's trying to create the foundation where people can make better choices and motivate them to make better choices. So I was asking him about, what are things that predict positive outcomes among patients? And what he said is that he cited a study, Wampold et al., 2007, I believe, where they looked across the board at effectiveness of psychotherapy. And one of the main predictors of successful patient outcomes among patients who use psychotherapy was how much they trusted their psychotherapist and how much they felt that that person understood them and had their best interests at heart. So I do think it's pretty significant, and I think that's something I take to heart too in the work that I do in this effort to try to get information to application. Now, that is a different field, and it is something that's been documented in the field of science communication as well. So this is from a synthesis paper by Nisbet and Schoeffer, 2009, and in it they write, I think, similar things. I'll just read it along similar themes. They write, nonetheless, they're talking about deliberative forums as a way of increasing application of science information and leading to transformation of beliefs. And they write, nonetheless, deliberative forums, if carefully organized, can shape perceptions of scientists as open to feedback and respectful of public concerns, perceptions that actually predict eventual acceptance and satisfaction with the policy outcome, even if the decision is contrary to an individual's original preference. So they're talking about behavior change and what leads to behavior change. And although it's not necessarily a direct line, I think those relationship building pieces are key if you're interested in creating behavior change, especially in areas where people might have strong resistance. So invest in relationship. It sounds good. How do you actually do it? I don't necessarily know, but I do have some ideas. So I think things you can do is show that you're interested in people, show that you're interested in their success. If they're people you're working with and you want to see them succeed and you want them to see them apply information in different ways, you can listen for values and what they actually care about. I think that not only might help you relate to people, or it does help me relate to people, but it helps me understand, what pitfalls to avoid, what things to not start with, for example. So I think another thing is I, in my work, try to show respect for the knowledge that people bring to the table. I work primarily with ranchers, but I also work with people from various agencies, and all of those people have knowledge. People have a great deal of knowledge that they bring to the table, and I think it's hard to ask people to possibly make a change when you first haven't listened to what they know and have validated the experience and knowledge that they are bringing. All right, so I wanted to mention people are already doing this. There's a lot of great examples of collaborative adaptive management in the Western U.S. and beyond, but you all today perhaps are people who are already practicing things like this and having success implementing adaptive management or getting information into the hands of people who are making decisions about it. There's also the Collaborative Adaptive Rangeland Management Experiment. That's the ARS and CSU experiment, and that's who was supposed to talk to you today. But I'd really recommend getting in touch with those folks if you have questions, because they have done a great job. I also think of the University of Arizona, and this is a selective list because it's what I was familiar with off the top of my head, but University of Arizona has a very successful cooperative monitoring program. And of course, there's quite a few more examples of effective collaboration and cooperation around contentious issues, or at least perhaps not contentious, but getting information to be applied. So in summary, thinking about adaptive management, how do we use what we know about people to make us even more effective at our jobs? I think it's important to consider what we know from social psychology and communication research, that people are more inclined to integrate information that already agrees with their pre-existing beliefs and other biases that we have. And rather than fight this, I recommend that we work within it and find ways to engage people in meaningful ways. This could be cooperative monitoring, it could be collaborative management, it could be focus groups. I think trust is a gateway drug to behavior change, and you can invest, and I can invest in relationships in cases where I really want to see that transition from learning to doing occur. So thank you very much, and if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them.